Professor Oh, this is a Chinese documentary, and yet we know these kind of documentaries been made in China, in South Korea, even in Japan, and elsewhere in Asia. What do you make of the strong messages coming from these movies?
Well, first of all, I share my sincere gratitude to the Chinese people who finally got to the point of acknowledging the ongoing saga of all these women we call shamefully comfort women. Now we are on the same historical understanding line where two peoples in East Asia can freely talk about this problem and share our anguish and emotion about these women and try to find future solutions together for the betterment of our future. So I sincerely welcome of these new documentaries, and I know that this is second of the series. So I really appreciate all the efforts shown by the Chinese people, especially the director of the documentary film, trying to produce several important, significant contributions to human history.
Well, Mr. Jia, as you may know, here in China, this is not the first one, not even the second one, documentaries, not to mention novels and books and other means of letting the public know of what happened with the comfort women. But this is one of those very made public as a result of the support provided by the movie theaters and I guess the movie distribution channels. What do you make of the success of this documentary in the ticket box?
Most of them are young people of China. So they go to the theater to see the documentary, not kind of Hollywood style action film, but
what does it say?
It says a lot about the thinking of the Chinese young people.
Watching the real person recounting the horrific stories happened to them in their lives earlier is totally a very different experience. I remember one of those elderly citizens said in the movie, and here I quote, "The world is so good. Sustain your life to be witness to it, even if that means eating only wild vegetables." That's one of those surviving comfort women who said that to the documentary filmmakers when she was being filmed. She was just not necessarily telling every details of the suffering she had, but rather celebrate her life. I guess that's a lot of strength in it. Professor Oh, for Korean women, there were a lot of those similar stories as well, I would assume.
Yeah, there are many similar stories in Korea as well. We have more women speaking out loud to the world about their anguish problems and stigmatization in their own societies as well, especially calling for apologies, sincere apologies from the Japanese government. They do not ask for any material benefit, reparation from the government or Japanese people, but they want sincere apologies because the words they cannot express is the emotion they have to hide from the beginning, the point when they were victimized. And the word of sincere apology is what they really ask for. And these women had gone through terrible life, not only in Japan, China, or elsewhere, but also in Korea as well.
But Professor Oh, as you may know, there were earlier an agreement between the Park Geun-hye administration and the Abe administration in Japan, talking about seal a deal to deal with so-called comfort women issue in South Korea. What this deal is about? It's about, quote, an apology from Prime Minister Abe plus $8 million so-called to compensate the sufferings. But I guess, Professor Oh, since then there were a lot of opposition voices coming from the Korean public against this specific agreement, saying this is not the way to heal the wounds. Professor Oh, what would you say?
Well, this is the repetition of the same mistake that the Korean government has been committing since the beginning of the problem. That is, when in 1962, Park Geun-hye's father, President Park Chung-hee, also signed a deal in 1965, with the Japanese during his normalization treaty efforts. And at that time, they never even discussed this issue with the comfort women victims, but they signed a deal saying all the reparation has been paid for by the Japanese government. But this is the second time that the Japanese government and the Korean government signing the same kind of treaty without talking to the victims themselves, saying that we'll pay one more time, please seal it forever. Now, as I told earlier, money is not the issue here, and it's not a lot of money. I mean, even a scant amount of money, it doesn't really need for these people. And what they're really asking for is a sincere apology, and they want participation in the decision-making process. If anybody want to sign a treaty between the two governments, the victims must be heard for the first time before any signing takes place.
Mr. Jia, now in China there were also civil lawsuits against the Japanese invaders then who were committing crimes to these comfort women. The reason we call them comfort women, it was used by the Japanese during the Second World War, but actually the nature of these women are sex slaves. They were put and forced into sex slavery during the Second World War. Mr. Jia, do we see much result of those lawsuits?
Actually, the Japanese court denied the request of the victims, and they acknowledged some of the facts of the sex slavery, but they refused the lawsuit because they said, well, the individuals have no right to sue the Japanese government. So that's kind of a huge disappointment for their victims. So actually that's in line with the Japanese current policy of not acknowledging any responsibility of Japan, that state, in the wartime atrocities. So, with this, the comfort women were victims of wartime crimes and wartime atrocities. Now they have become victims of some kind of historical distortion in Japan, giving a very strong right-wing movements in Japan, movements denying the history. That's what we see in Japanese textbooks, school books, which in the past they acknowledge some of the facts of historical fact, but now they're trying to delete those facts from the textbooks and history books.
I remember very clearly in that specific documentary we talk about, 22, there was one Japanese girl who was studying and working in China. She would go to try to comfort one of those left behind still comfort women living in a small mountain, very isolated. She tried to bring her some food and also some comfort by talking to her, interacting with her. But that is the effort of an individual. And that Japanese girl has not committed any crime. And yet we are seeing a government and an administration totally denying the history, despite of the fact there are many like those Japanese girls that I talk about who recognize what history has taught us and who want to help in the process. There's such a divide we are seeing from the administration and the public consensus over there in Japan. Having said so, Professor Oh, let me ask you about this. There's a dilemma. Many of the comfort women or the sex slaves that were forced into this during the Second World War by the Japanese are dying. They are in their 90s. Some are already reaching 100 years old. So the fewer likely of them going to speak out for the future process, whether to the public or bring a lawsuit against the Japanese government or then the Japanese government. So what can we do, Professor Oh?
Well, we need to also work hard together internationally to find a common historical understanding of this problem. The war crimes against women is a very universal, historically universal problem throughout human history. So we have to find some kind of international effort, organization to stop war crimes of all kinds against women to begin with. I think that's the very important first step that human beings can take to prevent any future atrocities against women during the war. As we speak of it, in Syria and other places, there are a lot of women who are mass raped and killed by soldiers of all kinds. So we need an international organization to stop war crimes against women. That's the first thing we have to work hard, and China should be a leader. Korea should help with China. We have to work together toward that goal. And number two, we have to have an international commission of some kind to establish a historical forum about war crimes against women of all kinds, including sex slaves from China, Korea, the Philippines, and Vietnam, and whatnot. So if these two efforts are internationally worked out together, cooperated between countries, that's a great progress in terms of historical preservation of this problem and future solution of this problem. Locally, I think China and Korea and Japan probably, if they agree, can work out some kind of deal, common deal in Asia, preventing a regional commission to stop war crimes against all kinds of women, I think.
It is very important, but at the same time, Mr. Jia, you may remember in the movie, the names of those who were filmed in the documentary. At the end of it, there was a list. And actually, most of them were being crossed out because they've just passed away. Out of the 22, only 8 left on that board. It's such a tragedy that they would not even see justice being done at the end of their life, even though they have once again unhealed their wounds in order to tell the world what exactly happened during the Second World War. Now, Mr. Jia, besides the International Commission, the regional framework that Professor Oh had been talking about, there's another thing. That is, these women have been isolated by their own people as well. Out of so-called traditional belief of purity of women and out of people's understanding, lack of understanding of what happened, the atrocities to their lives. So I guess there's something not just the Japanese need to realize, but also the local people, whether in China, South Korea, Vietnam, or the Philippines, they need to do for women who have been harmed and hurt. Mr. Jia.
Actually, much has changed in the past in the past 1 or 2 decades when it comes to the issue of the sex slavery, and more people in China now get to know the history, the facts about that. So they have already showed their sympathy, and what is more important is that people would like to record history and make sure that the history will not repeat. But for the survivors of the sex slavery, and they are waiting for justice to be handed out to those who committed the crimes. And this is a dying group, of course, and the numbers of survivors are dwindling. And also, but on the other hand, the Japanese government and those right-wing forces actually are waiting for their deaths. They believe that, well, that period of history may go away with the death of those sex slaves. So it is the responsibility of the current generation in China, also in other countries, including the Republic of Korea and other countries in Asia, to make sure that they will continue to record history. Actually, so far, recently, we're still discovering more evidence on that crimes, including footage, video clips about that part of history. Now, actually, there are many organizations, non-government organizations, that are working to try to ask the UNESCO to include the historical records into its Memory of the World Register. That is one step that people in China and other countries can work together to ensure that people in the future can have access to those historical records. It is accessible readily accessible to future generations.
I see. Professor Oh, as a historian, you must be very familiar with many of the literatures and records related to the Second World War. The Comfort Women documentary made by China, made by South Korea, for example, The Apology, another one that has won the Busan International Film Festival award, are very well known these days. But there are other literatures as well. For example, The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang, that's a Chinese-American journalist. We see them once and again, and yet, how come the real record of the history are still not commonly recognized? As a historian, why is it so hard? Help us to understand, to look back at history, to remember, and therefore eventually reconcile.
Well, the problem is, as you said earlier, it's about the tales of women who became victimized and stigmatized by the enemies in their own society. So all the men who were involved in the crime were committed to destroying historical documents, whatever there was any left. Luckily, we have some surviving documentations dug up by one Japanese historian and some other Japanese scholars from the Japanese government side. But also in Korea, we dug up several other pieces from different countries, as well as the Chinese government who found important precious documents. All these documents add up to one fact, historical fact, that the Japanese government was involved in the kidnapping and recruiting of these girls. But again, historians in the so-called former imperialist societies still argue that history must be written objectively, based on concrete evidence. They do not recognize tales, testimonies by these women. So it is time that we have to rewrite history based on new philosophy of history, that is, that we have to take care of, or at least count victims' tales into account in our real history book, so that in the future people can listen to victims' voices as well as victors' voices at the same time. And it is again based on our educational principle. As you said earlier, even in Korea, we are split, divided into two groups of people, historians especially, saying, one group saying that we need exactly concrete evidence to say anything about the sex slavery. On the other hand, there are historians who argue that victims' voices count in our historical restoration of the facts. So I think we, in Asia at least, we need to be open-minded and be more objective, in the sense that we have to take victims' voice into account as well.